On this episode of PodPaca, we are going to talk about football right before the NFL season. We are going to talk with a sports journalist, and we are going to see what he is doing now and how he is involved in central Wisconsin communities, including Waupaca and Stevens Point, all in this episode of PodPaca. Usually on episodes of PodPaca, we just talk with the guest. We might have something before, but on this episode, it's going to be a little bit different. First off, it's just me today hosting. Tim is not feeling well today, so it'll just be me and our guest Mike Beacom today. And also, we are going to talk with Mike first, and then we are going to talk about the upcoming NFL season, since that will be in just a couple days. The first game is Thursday night between the Bills and the Rams, and that'll be the start of week 1 of the NFL season. So I want to get straight into talking with Mike today. Our guest today, you could say that he is a fantasy sports pioneer back in the day. He is very influential in the development of the Fantasy Sports Writers Association. But now he is not doing fantasy football as much anymore. He is now the executive director for NASCA. So please welcome to PodPaca, Mike Beacom. How are you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing well. Good to be with you, Joe.
So I do want to start out with talking about how you are involved in the local community. I know that you are in Waupaca and you are also in Stevens Point. Can you go further into detail about that?
Sure. So my partner, Brian Van Stippen, and I, longtime friends, and actually we'll get to fantasy sports later, but we had started a business together in the early 2000s. And that ran its course probably after 8 or 9 years. And from that, we had a good working relationship and a long-time friendship. And so we looked at what we might do together to continue that relationship, and found real estate and started investing in Stevens Point, as you mentioned. And as that grew and developed, we were looking for other opportunities. And I live between Stevens Point and Waupaca in the town of New Hope. Waupaca is a community I'm familiar with. I'm originally from Ripon, so it was in our conference growing up and not far from there, and started buying property in Waupaca and working with the community and business leaders. It's work I enjoy doing. It's really, for me, that's the investment side of things. It's not so much my career, but often it can feel like a full-time job. But it's really just servicing people, whether it's commercial units or residential, and trying to fill a need, but also, doing what you can to work with the community to build a better place for people to be.
What stood out to you about Waupaca in particular with making that small community better?
Other than the fact of the proximity, and it's also on the Highway 10 corridor, which is key for us because my partner is based in the Valley. It, like Stevens Point, it has a thriving downtown. And the downtown is not dependent on the lake crowd. I think a lot of people think that. It's an active downtown year round. And so your folks have a couple of really nice businesses, and I think the business community downtown was a draw for us. The other thing that I really enjoy right now is that the leadership in Waupaca is mostly made up of local people. I find that they support small businesses, and they're community focused, and they're easy to work with. And so those are things, if you're kind of a small company like we have, you really want people that you're able to work with and invest in, and that you can get to know.
You completely are right about the downtown thriving, and it's not because of the lakes. A lot of people, just when I've worked at Lucky Tree and Northern Home at my parents' shops, they say at the end of the summer, you guys are losing all the summer people. Well, there's a lot of people that come by in Christmas time, Black Friday, Thanksgiving. There's a lot of people still that help the downtown stay strong, and they are mostly local people, not tourists. So Waupaca is still going really strong, and population has also gone up 4% already this year, just in the city, I believe. So,
Yeah,
oh,
new development, new housing development in these last few years, but also the investment into downtown that was made last year to kind of remake the streetscape. I think that helped, and that also some of the areas that maybe of the downtown that didn't have as much traffic, you're starting to see that north end really become a draw. And so I do feel like the community as a whole supports the downtown, which is great.
oh yeah, the downtown looks beautiful now with the new Main Street construction all done. And they're doing they did some work with the library block where the bandstand is as well. They did some work this summer, so it's looking great down there. So with Waupaca, is there anything that you like to do for fun? Do you like to go on the lakes at Waupaca at all, or do you kind of stay in the New Hope Point area mostly with your free time?
You know, I don't have a ton of free time, but for Waupaca, what I enjoy, being downtown, Little Fat Gretchen's, the shops we go into, we mentioned folks place, but also Main Street Marketplace, and grab coffee at Aquamos if I'm in town. I kind of just like hanging out, especially when I'm in town doing work. I feel like there's stuff to do. Um, and yeah, when I do get out, this area, central Wisconsin, there's nice trails. Where I live, it's near the Ice Age Trail, and so I think that those things too, recreational things, are a draw for us.
So I did want to get into your background a little bit, especially with sports journalism and fantasy sports. Can you talk about how you got into that?
So growing up, it was pretty clear. I don't know, probably when I was young, sports were my life, but it was not something that I was going to do for a career or even in college. But I collected sports cards. I read Sports Illustrated and Sport Magazine religiously, and so writing was an opportunity to have a connection to what my passion was if I wasn't able to do that. And I think that that's a plug for writing in general. I mean, you maybe you want to be a rock star, but that's not going to happen. But journalism and the ability to write and communicate some of those things is one way to be connected to your passions. And so that began early on. I went to Stevens Point, University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, which is not a strong journalism or even communication school, but it's a school I wanted to go to. There were plenty of opportunities for me to be part of their student newspaper and also other media. And when I got out of school, I took a job at the Weekly in town, but really to buy time because I wanted to establish a freelance career. And I was probably at the tail end of journalism and the news business, because that was really the time of transition between daily newspapers and even magazines and everything moving to digital. But I did get in at that time, and it took some time. Fantasy sports was a way for me to get an easier access into sports than maybe traditional sports. I did later spend a number of years covering the NFL at large and also the Big Ten for a number of outlets. But fantasy had a growing demand in the the late 90s and early 2000s. Fantasy sports was not respected. A lot of people would not mention it on their radio shows, national radio shows. You didn't see it on Fox Sports like you do today. It was looked down upon, but there were millions of people that played it, and there was a healthy demand for content. And so we started a company, Fantasy GMs, in 2001 or 2002. I wouldn't say that we were early. The early people that were really in the late 80s, early 90s, those were people that were doing mail service. I mean, they would come up with cheat sheets, they would have subscribers, and they would drop it in the mail, express mail, to get it to people by Thursday or Friday, because at that point you didn't have a weekly Thursday game. It was a totally different business model. We kind of came in with that second wave, which is a big wave of fantasy industry. and provided content for a number of years. And from that, I was able to work independently full time and grew that into other areas of sports journalism.
For those who don't know, can you quickly explain what fantasy football exactly is?
Absolutely. So the quick description would be, you're picking players and their real performances in games generate points for you to play a virtual game against your friends, either total points where everybody's kind of lumped in together for the week, or most often you go head to head. So there's somebody that you're scheduled to play. And if your team of real players and their real performances outscores your opponent based on whatever scoring system you use, you win. The origin, fantasy football, a lot of people don't know this, it's traced as far back as the 60s, the early 60s, to the Oakland Raiders franchise. Some of their minority owners, notably Bill Winkenbach, had started a league. And the first person picked was George Blanda, I think in the 1963 fantasy draft. It was called Goppel, and I forget what Goppel stands for. But they started playing this game. And at the time, Oakland had a scout, Ron Wolf, who later became the Packers general manager. And I interviewed Ron Wolf a number of times, but I interviewed him about that. And he would say, yeah, these guys would take him out for dinner and they'd ask about other players around the league, because part of his responsibilities as being the one and only scout that Al Davis had on his staff at that time, which was somewhat, not every team had that structure, but the Raiders did, the Cowboys did. Ron Wolf had to scout other players. If they came on the waiver wire or trades, he had to know that. Every team has a personnel department that scouts other teams now, but they wanted to know that information for their fantasy league. Fantasy baseball took off. It got bigger sooner, but really the origins for that are probably mid-late 70s. But this Goppel League, kind of the first unofficial origins of fantasy football.
And that was fantasy football. Was this before any other fantasy sports?
Believed to be. I mean, they wouldn't have probably called it fantasy football back then. Didn't really know. I mean, they were doing the same things we're doing today, but no structure, no history to draw from. And so you did see in the 80s, you saw books, usually a thick book that would come out annually that would have unique statistics for people that played. By the early 90s is when you started to see magazines on newsstands, more content. Mid-late 90s, you saw online game management. CBS, I think actually CBS purchased the first fantasy league software. And so that's when things really took off in kind of the 90s, early 2000s.
So before the internet, how exactly was fantasy football just done by hand with paper and math by someone just calculating it all?
So much better. Back then, now most people have a draft and you're in front of your computer and basically you're detached. Everybody's in a different location. At that time, you had to be together. So it was an event to have a draft because you didn't have the technology to do it any other way. And you had to watch games, but there was a race to the box score the next day to compute what you had, because there just wasn't the same availability of stats and the numbers we rely on. Fantasy baseball was even more complex. We get subscriptions to Baseball America or other publications because they would have complete listings where your local newspaper may not have the Padres box score that you need, and you couldn't just go online and find it. And so I think it was more fun because it wasn't real time, where right now everybody has to be satisfied this second and find out what happened this second. There was time, and that builds anticipation. It stretched out your week. And I feel like you were more involved because of that. But it was more of a camaraderie community thing, where now I think it's a little bit more about the game itself and some other things. But, that's part of the evolution.
That's it. That's interesting with did you play yourself before the internet with fantasy
Sure.
football, or were you right at the start of the internet?
The first league I was in was 1991, and there were four of us. I was, let's see, I think I was a sophomore in high school. And so 4-team league, and we had a snake draft. And my first two picks were Jerry Rice and Andre Reed, back-to-back 4 and 5. And I took Emmitt Smith in the third round in 1991. And in that league went 30 plus years.
Wow.
I had Emmitt Smith all the way from 1991 until he retired and won me a number of titles. But yeah, so we started playing then. There were nobody else in our school was playing, but certainly the league had existed, or fantasy had existed before that.
I just find it so interesting comparing. Oh, did you play in high school, middle school? Did you start?
High school. I was a sophomore. Yeah.
Yeah, I find it interesting comparing it to myself because I commission a league with a lot of my friends and people I know in the community, and we started. My dad helped me get started around when I was in 5th or 6th grade, and it was very interesting just everyone learning about how to play, and like you would find it. You maybe won't be expected to see a bunch of like 6th graders having a party where they're all looking at magazines and having cheat sheets and notes trying to figure out what football player to draft.
Sure.
But it ended up bringing a group of people together in such a unique way, and brought people closer together. And I don't know how, I imagine that did the same thing with your league when it started to grow after 4 people at some point.
Yeah, it's more acceptable today, and it's common. And actually, to your point, there are people that have tried to build a bridge between fantasy sports and mathematics to use it as part of an elementary or middle school curriculum, because you do have to, there's a number of things that just play well to math development for students. When we were doing it, it was geekish stuff. Like, what are you guys doing? And, that was odd to other people. Now it's so mainstream, you would maybe be looked down upon if you didn't play some sort of fantasy sports, because so many people do it. Back then, we were probably the only game in town. So much different.
With your league, the personalities in the league were pretty similar. There wasn't like, a guy that was an athlete or whatnot, and all from all different, clubs in the school or cliques.
I would say we were all athletes. We were all people that collected sports cards. So we were into that. And I think that those communities kind of tie in well. We were people that were interested in something beyond just watching a game on Sunday. And so, there was 4 people from very similar type of interests and friends doing it. But yeah.
Yeah, like with it being so mainstream and stuff, there was I did notice there's a lot of, people from different friend groups in school that were in the league, and like just telling teachers about it, they would be like, wait, what? You guys are all doing this together? You guys are not similar at all. And stuff like that. So I don't know if that was, maybe it's just because of it being more mainstream that was the case.
I think it is. And maybe one of the positives of that evolution is it can be a connector for people that otherwise would be connected. And society certainly needs more of that today.
Oh yeah, for sure. And do you think, I've noticed this as well, me and my dad, when we started playing fantasy football, it made us watch football in a completely new way.
Sure. I mean, I talked about how traditional media really didn't show respect for fantasy. True for team media. One of the first assignments I had would have been maybe the fall of 2001, working for Draft Sharks, and they're still around, and doing a story. And I just wanted to talk to a position coach. And this is read by 20,000 some subscribers. So it's a decent audience. We don't talk to fans. I mean, and still today, if you had just a strictly angle for a piece, you're probably not going to get through to media, but the league itself looked down on it. And now it's such big business that the league can't ignore it. I mean, it's integrated in everything they do, and so I feel like it's one of those things where you can't escape it even if you wanted to.
Are you a Packer fan yourself?
I am, interestingly enough, and I get grief for this, but I grew up a fan of the Packers and the Cowboys. My dad was a Cowboys fan through the 70s. And in those days, in the early 80s, when I was first watching football, maybe 80 or 81 or 82, something like that, the Cowboys were always the 3 o'clock game on CBS. So CBS pretty much dominated football coverage then. And the Cowboys often had the national game. And so you could watch them every week. And so I grew up watching a lot of Packers, Cowboys, and for a number of those years in the 80s, they both were awful. But I've been on the ups and downs of both of those teams, and people often ask me, how can you be a fan of both? And I have 2 kids. I don't root for one, not the other. I'm able to love them both and cheer from both, and it's kind of like that for those 2 teams. And when they play each other, I just tough it out and try to enjoy it, and it is what it is.
Yeah, and hey, that's probably why you got Emmitt Smith, huh? You kind of knew a little bit more about him compared to the other guys.
He wasn't a bad pick. In 91 was the first year he led the league in rushing. So he was a rookie in 90 and was rookie of the year. But I mean, I think he had under 1,000 yards. He did have under 1,000 yards in his rookie year. But in 91, he led the league and led the league the next 2 years after that. And yeah, not a bad player to have. Probably did pick him for that reason, but it worked out okay.
I did not expect you to be a Cowboys fan around here. You do
Nobody
not
does.
see many Cowboys fans, but like if you are watching football and you have a fantasy team, let's say, just for those that haven't played fantasy football before, you want the Packers to win, but let's say they play the Vikings and you got Justin Jefferson or Adam Thielen on your team. You want them to score a touchdown on the Packers still sometimes, but you still want them to lose. It's kind of weird. Like you celebrate a Vikings touchdown maybe, and but you don't want them to beat the Packers.
Well, and to your original question, which I kind of went on a tangent, but it is the point I was making is that what you're describing, that's been proven to be good for the NFL. That fans for many years, the first 75 years of the league, you watched the Packers, you cared about the Packers. You didn't care what happened in the Cardinals game because most people are a fan of one team. And if you're watching something else, maybe you watch Monday Night Football because it was an event for a period of time, but you were locked into that. When fantasy blew up, you're right. Now you're watching this game, which you wouldn't care less about, but you're counting on one tight end to get 6 catches and at least 50 yards to get 11 points. And very much like my Cowboys, Packers, if they're playing each other, that can now happen to people all the time because the team you're rooting for, you often are rooting for somebody else in the opposing team to do well. So there's that internal negotiation of, let this person get 150 yards and 3 touchdowns, and hopefully we win and I have it both ways. It's a weird dynamic that's been added, but it's been good for the NFL. I think it's been good for fans. I think it's made fans more informed on the game as a whole because now they watch more games. They're more interested in other things that maybe they didn't pay attention to before. So on the whole, it's been good. It's kind of also contributed to the NFL's oversaturation, in my opinion, which is now every week you have a Thursday game, you have a Sunday night game, you have a Monday game. The off season seems shorter because there's just this never-ending cycle of news. And I do think that for everything, even football, it's good to have that down cycle so that you can build back up the anticipation and the excitement for the next season, the NFL almost is a 365-day news cycle now. And so, you lose a little bit of that buildup, I think.
Well, yeah, you see it with the draft too. There's almost as many people watching a draft as, the World Series now.
Well, and the draft is kind of my other animal. The first draft I watched was 1988, and I only watched a part of it. 1988 was the last year it was televised during the week. And I had bet my brother $1 that the Packers would take Brett Fullwood, and they did with the number 4 overall pick, and that he ended up being a bust. But you could watch a little bit of it before you went to school because it began in the morning. In 1989, which was probably one of the best draft classes ever, it moved to the weekend. But even then, it was very geekish. My brother and I watched all 7 rounds. I want to say maybe even in 1989, it may have still been 12 rounds then. But we watched the full draft, the entire Saturday and Sunday week, through the weekend. Nobody else was doing that. And there were people say, why don't you just check the next day? They'll tell you who got picked. But the coverage, the kind of speculation, all that stuff made it interesting. Today, it's an event. It comes to a community. People go to it in the thousands. I went to the 2004 draft in New York, which was another historic draft because Eli Manning didn't want to play for San Diego. And so, that Madison Square Garden was still a draw, and that was a big deal, but it's not like it is today. So that's a case where the NFL has taken something that was at one point used to be, niche or very small, and it's been blown up into this huge deal. And the draft is talked about for 5 months or 6 months of the year. They have been able to milk all of those things to get the most out of them, for better or worse.
In 2004, did you go as a journalist or as a fan?
A little bit of both. I did have a press credential, but I didn't have it we worked with somebody that put out material to teams. So he sold some of his analysis to a few teams. At that point, teams still bought independent scouting reports. I doubt they do that today. But we helped him with his product, and I wanted to be there. So that's the only draft I went to, but I'm glad I did. It was a good experience, and drove out there, and we're credentialed for the weekend, and it was a good time.
Well, yeah, I bet you got to have a bunch of inside scoop stuff you got to see as a journalist and you probably were excited as a fan too.
It's different to watch it in person. It's almost in some ways the coverage is better on TV. You get a little bit more of the insight of what's going on. I can't say that as big of a deal as the Eli Manning, Phillip Rivers thing was in 2004. It wasn't as big of a thing at the event. It's different. The hype is a little bit less sometimes when you're in person.
Yeah, I can see that, television just over dramatizing or just being over dramatic about certain situations, even though that was a big deal, especially for San Diego fans, that Eli did not want to go to their team. And it was a Manning. That's a really big football name. But yeah, I'm kind of surprised to hear that it wasn't a big deal there. Was it just because people didn't know?
I don't think it wasn't that it wasn't a big deal. It just wasn't probably as dramatic as it was from a television viewing audience, because when you're there, you only see the stage, and you're not necessarily getting the behind the scenes. And in 2004, it's not like there wasn't digital coverage, but I probably had a flip phone in 2004 if I had a cell phone. So it's not like today where I can watch whatever I want to watch on my handheld cellular. You didn't have that. So if you were in person at that time, you were only seeing what was in front of you. You weren't seeing the things that were behind the scenes going on that a TV audience could see.
Yeah. You are now the executive director for NASCA. Can you explain why you have switched careers and what influenced that decision to go into a new field?
So I've always done a lot of different things at the same time. Rarely anything full time, but some things take a bigger portion of my plate, if you will. So conservation is something that I've been involved in for 20 years, and not as a conservationist. I don't have a degree in natural resources. A good friend of mine, Bill Berry, got me connected in conservation, really to do communication work back in the fall of 2000. So I had worked for a group for the past 20 plus years, and it starts with doing articles, putting together reports, newsletters, and that turned into staffing, policy, advocacy work, partnership, grant, making sure that we're fulfilling grant agreements. So it's been something I've been involved with for most of my career. I don't do much in sports. I write an article for Lindy's NFL Preview magazine. You can find that in just about any gas station, bookstore. This last year, I did a story on the growing number of women in the NFL, both on the sidelines, but also in front office positions. And so usually I do a feature article, a few thousand words on something different going on with the game. And then I help somebody else that really helped get me a start. I help him a little bit with sales, but it's pretty minimal in terms of what I'm doing with sports today. The conservation piece takes up most of my time, but I enjoy it. NASCA is the National Association of State Conservation Agencies. Every state has an office within government that helps to get program funding on the ground for conservation work, often for private landowners looking to put conservation practices on their farms or on their lands. And so my job is to represent the interests of those 50 plus offices, if you count our territories, and both in work that I do in Washington, D.C., but whatever I can do to support them and their needs.
Do you have to go to Washington, D.C. often now, or are you able to stay in the area still?
I go about once a month. And so that's more often than I was going. My previous job before COVID, maybe a handful of times a year. It's more important now for me to be in DC and to meet with our key partners regularly. We're communicating through Zoom. It works. It's not quite the same though, in terms of relationships and just my ability to get around and meet with some people. So I anticipate I'm still relatively new into this position, but I probably will keep up once a month and get to DC.
So why did you want to get out of sports? Was just this opportunity just so good that you had to take it?
It's not even so much that I got out of sports. I would say I was straddling both for a while. There was a time I coached. I taught sports journalism for a number of years. More so that, I think I had my share of it. There's only so much I can do in terms of, writing. I used to write tens of thousands of words a day. And that sounds crazy, but I would say on a busiest day, upwards of 16, 18,000 words. On a light day, a few thousand words. That's cranking out a lot of copy and doing that day after day in my busy period, but even in my later periods, writing a ton throughout the year. I had done that. I think I burnt myself out a number of times. And also with football, I did appreciate the opportunity just to be a fan again. And so I still do a little bit of work. Sometimes I get the itch to write about something, but it's kind of nice to watch a game and not worry about covering it. I did some outside of fantasy. I did a number of things that were related to college basketball, pro and college football, attending games, that sort of thing. You're wearing a different hat. The experience is different. It's professional and there's some rewarding things about that, but it also, you lose that fan piece that got you into it in the first place.
Can you talk about how the experience was different from that point of view, going to an event like that?
It's hectic. And so, I covered a number of games, for example, at Camp Randall, or at the Kohl Center, with hoops. Camp Randall, you're going to find parking. You get to the game maybe an hour and a half before kickoff. You're gathering your information. You've done homework going in. The game moves quicker for some reason. You're observing it. Maybe that's because you're trying to track so many things. Naturally, it just seems to move quicker. Halftime is not enjoyable. Halftime is for catch up. And then when you're getting towards the end of the game, often UW, you can go down on the sideline for the last few minutes, and that's a nice experience, but you can capture some things there. Then you're immediately going into the locker room. So with Badger basketball, for example, you leave the game, you start to build a narrative in your mind of what the story is going to be, but you don't have quotes yet. So they'll make people available. When I was covering, Ryan was a coach. He offered a lot of good material, and that's helpful. You ask questions, you capture that, then it's a race to deadline because they're waiting for your story, and the clock is ticking. And so you're pushing that out. And there were nights I would leave the Kohl Center with an hour and a half, 2-hour drive, and I'm finishing up at 11, just making deadline, getting home at 1. It can be exhausting. So on the one hand, it sounds exciting, but it's not like going to a game. It's a lot more like going to work.
Yeah, I could see how, from that point of view, how that could be really stressful. And then I know you hear players now sometimes complain about maybe a question they get from a journalist, or maybe they don't like how they're treated, or an unfair question of some kind.
Well, I think there's a number of things that play to what you're getting at. One is, if you look at old clips of NFL games in the locker room, you may have a head coach with 4 microphones in his face, and those are the 4 people that cover the team. And now you have 30 plus that are there every day, and then another 30 maybe that come in on occasion that will get credentialed. So more people covering it. These are people that are not as informed as a traditional beat reporter. Some of these people really don't know the game as well, so they can ask questions that really have nothing to do with the game. They're not paying attention. The shift in content, where instead of having something that's in depth, now everything is quick. Everybody's looking for a more dramatic angle that maybe they're playing to. So they're trying to bait people with questions. And on the other side of the coin, the league would have been happy to have more people in its locker room. It wanted media, it wanted coverage. And now I think players and franchises feel like, why do we have to do this? We have our own media departments. There's plenty of coverage. Why do we have to sit here and answer these questions? The league and the media have a kind of an agreement between them on availability and those types of things. And it's good they do, because it holds the teams accountable to have to ask those questions. And so I'm always frustrated when I see players do that, because it projects that they're too good to have to sit there and answer questions. They're not too good. At the end of the day, it's all entertainment. And one piece is what they do, and one piece is what the media does to kind of feed that other side of our interest. And the two work together, and it's still just entertainment. So it's fallen out of sync, especially in the last decade or so. But I think both sides contribute to that.
Is that one reason maybe you didn't want to do as much as that, or with that?
Well, part of it, one of my last jobs was with a large media company, and I was in charge of their NFL team. So I had a team of writers, our centralized, sales department and graphic department, all these things. But we were really tasked with clickbait, for lack of a better term. We were, how you phrase a tease, how you phrase a headline, the photo you use, those were the most important components. And getting things out really quick to beat the competition so that we would rank number 1 on Google. So it was systematic. And it really wasn't about the depth of the content. It was about the speed of the content. And it was more about the sensationalism that drove clicks and ultimately could drive sales. And to me, it's not what I find has value. I'm more interested in objectivity, but also giving me something that I don't know about the game, new insights, something that I can learn versus just feeding my impulse of sensational content.
Oh yeah, I completely agree with that. You're seeing that more with not just sports, but just all news in
Sure.
general, with clickbait especially. There are some people that still kind of do what you were talking about, what you enjoy the most. I kind of think of Hard Knocks. That
Sure.
show. It seems like there's a lot of new information that you learn about the football players' lives and the coaches' lives because you are like it's almost like a backstage pass to what they're doing at training camp. But you don't really see that much just clickbait questions, I guess, on the majority of programs and articles.
Yeah, I think so. Hard Knocks is a good example of that type shifting to video, and video being maybe a better tool to tell those stories, the profile stories, behind the scenes stuff. There's one of the most famous works of journalism is a story that Esquire did. Gay Talese, Sinatra has a cold, and it's a story about Frank Sinatra, but it's not. Frank Sinatra is never interviewed in this new journalism piece that was done. It's all the people around him telling you about Frank Sinatra. And so it's a famous piece, but to me, when I think back on that, that's good storytelling, and Hard Knocks is an example of that. And so I'm finding out about how this team is being built from all of these different side angles and perspectives. And there is a demand for that, a hunger for that. I think video probably does it better. People don't want to read more than 50 words, let alone 5,000. And so that's where things have shifted, I think, today to get that type of unique perspective on something.
Yeah, and even with this podcast, like if we, just wrote out the interview, I think people would not nearly as much listen or not listen, read that. They rather listen to it while they're in the car, on a walk, or watch it on YouTube. Uh, and does that also contribute to you not wanting to do uh, sports articles as much just because people are going to watch a video of whatever article you might have written? They rather watch a video than read it.
Yeah, I mean, the things I do are still long form, and not much of it, but I'm guilty. I watch video content. I consume different things. I still look for the long form piece, but I sometimes, based on my schedule, I only have time to just get the snippets. So I think it's consuming in different ways, but clearly the attention span is shortening for society, and it probably, it's probably passed me by, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much that's good. I don't know about you. Attention span of society going down. I think I'm noticing it myself.
Yeah, I don't think it is good. I don't know that it can be changed at this point. But it's not just our ability to consume information. It's our patience for what our expectation is to get a result, whether it's an election, a game result, whatever. If it's over, we expect a full story and analysis immediately, and are disappointed if we can't get it within 3 minutes. And so it says as much about society's expectations or unrealistic expectations as anything.
Well, I do want to make sure that we talk about this upcoming NFL season. I do think that people will want to know from your fan perspective and your background perspective of football, what you think of this upcoming NFL season. Uh, First, I want to know if you're excited about the Thursday night football game, the first game of the season, Bills and Rams. I think that's the most exciting Thursday night kickoff game in the last few years here.
Yeah, and when we look at some of those, a few years ago, the Rams and the Chiefs had a classic, and it was a back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes those games where you expect that, they end up being flat. They either low scoring or they're a blowout. I don't know why it works out that way. The Rams have some issues, some injury things and some distractions, I feel like. Not to say that the Rams are not going to do well in kind of coming back after, Super Bowl last year. But it's an intriguing matchup. Part of me thinks that might fall flat a little bit. The Bills have been that team where even 2 years ago, they were a popular pick, certainly were last year. So now I think that they are the team everybody expects can unseat Cincinnati and can be the AFC team and maybe the team. Certainly have the talent. If the defense lives up to what people think it should, and Allen plays as well as he has, they're in that position. But I do like we talk about the NFL kind of milking everything it can. I love the tradition of this Thursday opener. I do like the fact that they've shifted to in the last however many years, kind of one marquee game to kick things off with. It wasn't always that way, but they've given us kind of an anticipated matchup. I think last year was Tampa and Dallas.
Yeah.
And so, that is something that I think is a good thing for the league, and everybody's tuning in, and we'll see.
And with Thursday games, the first one is not on Amazon, but the rest of the Thursday night football games are on Amazon Prime, and I'm pretty sure they are not on cable at all. How do you feel about transitioning to streaming? I don't think as many people have Amazon Prime as, let's say, Netflix or Disney. So how do you feel about this pretty big change in football?
We'll go backwards a little bit for our conversation and the league being reluctant to embrace fantasy and what that meant. And as far as viewing habits, when fantasy really started to blow up in the early 2000s, 2005, somewhere in there, you saw this unexpected number of NFL Sunday tickets that DirecTV sold, and people signing up for DirecTV to get the Sunday ticket. I think you could say largely driven by fantasy. At that point, it was a couple $100. And the league recognized that. Certainly DirecTV capitalized on that. And that shifted viewership, and it shifted the way the league thought about presenting its product. I think Amazon is kind of just an extension of that, where it's true. There are people that don't have an Amazon Prime subscription. If those people care about the league like people did then, they're going to spend $180, whatever it is, and get Amazon Prime so they have Thursday night games. That will be good for Amazon. But I also think that is an entry point to a shift to more digital viewing. I'll give you an example. I have probably more apps than I need: Netflix, Paramount, and all of those. The one primary reason I still have cable is pro and college football. If that shifts to more digital platforms, then I think you're going to see cable is going to become pretty vulnerable. And so this is an experiment for the league, but also for viewing habits of people that have traditional TV, I think.
Yeah, I think if the NFL goes completely with streaming, I know there's NFL Plus, and I know NFL Sunday Ticket is still on DirecTV this year, but I'm pretty sure this is the last year it's on DirecTV. If that transitions to, Amazon having Sunday Ticket, I think that will be the end of cable. 92 of the 100 most watched programs last year on cable were NFL games. And ESPN, I know that they're going to have ESPN programming on ESPN Plus, so you can watch college games. If football goes away and all the other sports with ESPN, I think cable might be dead.
Yeah, I mean, and it could be, and everything. There has to be an evolution for everything, but it does seem like the NFL was the boost that DirecTV relied on, and so the NFL could be that for digital streaming, and it's been there. But to your point, this is really kind of where you got to have it if you want to watch it. So yeah.
Well, yeah, and you're already seeing it with like Apple having MLB, and well, you can watch some of the CBS games on Paramount Plus. You were able to last year, but it was still on CBS. But you weren't able to stream it later, I don't think. Moving on, talking about more football things instead of streaming. I know that majority of people watching this are Packer fans. I know you're a Packer fan. What do you expect the Packers to do this year? Will they improve or will they decline from last year?
For the past several years, they're kind of just at the door, but can't seem to push through. It's frustrating. I would also say, very much like I remind people that you're frustrated that the Badgers don't win the Rose Bowl every year or get there every year. There were a lot of years where you couldn't give away Badgers football tickets. And so now the Badgers win 8 to 10 games every year, and people are unhappy if they don't reach a certain point. Same is true for the Packers. It's nice that they're successful every year, and people lose sight of that. Yeah, you want to pull more championships out of a franchise quarterback, especially somebody that's an all-time great like Rodgers. But it is nice that we're competitive every year. I still feel like every year we're missing key pieces. And so for the longest time, that was probably secondary. We just could not, we get into track meets and our defense could not hold, and eventually that would be our downfall. Last year, I think we saw our defense outperformed expectations, but going into this year, now the concern is the opposite side, and it's our receiving core, and we really don't have established weapons.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to rely on Rodgers making lesser people great, which was always true of Favre, and I think for a lesser extent, that's been true of Rodgers too. Where he's taken people that were not high-profile talent and turned them into great receivers. Problem is it takes time. Davante Adams was not an overnight success. He dropped a lot of footballs in his first couple of years and became somebody that people think, oh, he's a top 5 player in the league. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think he's a top 5 receiver when he's with an elite quarterback, and maybe Carr is and maybe he's not. I think Rodgers contributed a lot to that, but it does take time. And so with what they have at the receiving core, that's a challenge. Having the backfield we do, I think is great. But the offensive line has been deep, but injuries have been an issue there. And last year, it was amazing what that unit overcame and still held up with injuries, and cannot be expected every year. So I think the defense can be great. Now everybody expects it to be great, so we'll see. The pass rush seems to be there, and that's, you have to have a pass rush, and you have to be able to defend 3 deep. You got to have 3 good corners or capable corners. So I think the defense has the pieces, but the receiving core is going to be the concern. And let's face it, the NFC still has some competition. The Cowboys, who knows? But the Buccanners are not what they were 2 years ago, but they're competitive. The Rams are not what they were last year, but they're competitive. There's some good teams in the NFC. The AFC is probably better, but the NFC, it's not an easy path to the Super Bowl. And ultimately, I think the Packers are probably no better shape than they were a year ago.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you just said, to be honest. The receivers are obviously the weakest point. We just lost Adams. I know that Aaron's going to be a bit more forced to share the ball with a bunch of running backs, receivers, tight ends, because a lot of the targets were to Adams last year.
And that's what you saw in the playoff game. Quite honestly, this could be better for Rodgers, because if he's forced to really open things up and look around, I think that's better for him, and it's better for the passing game. And at the end of the seasons, and especially in the loss in the playoffs, what you saw was him trying to go to his most comfortable spot too often. And if a team's good enough to take that away, few teams are, but some are, that limited us. And he's good enough to spread the ball around, but for whatever reason, he was not doing that at the end of the season.
Yeah, and I think that's what cost the Packers against the 49ers, because they easily could have won, I think, that game.
Sure.
But they were probably targeting Adams too much, and that cost them at the end.
And I think you can say, and this goes to Aaron Rodgers' legacy, is that quarterbacks alone do not win and lose. But in NFL, they play a bigger role than anybody else. And in the biggest games in the last several years, the Packers have lost games that they probably should have won. They probably should have beaten the Buccanners the year before. As you pointed out, they should have won that game at the end of last season. And a lot of that does unfortunately fall on the quarterback. So I think Rodgers does have a little bit to play for his legacy. There's no question in terms of just precision, in terms of the ability to play the quarterback position. He may be the best quarterback to do that and all the things you ask somebody to execute. But quarterback position is so much bigger than that. And the reason that we look to people like Tom Brady and Joe Montana is their leadership abilities and the ability for them to elevate players around them, but also their ability to perform in those situations. Rodgers just has not done that.
Do you see anything changing this year? Let's say if they make the playoffs, do you think it would, because it kind of just seems like they're doing the same thing every year and the same result is happening every year?
It is. I mean, you may see a little bit of a power struggle that we haven't seen between sideline and player. Part of Rodgers doing what he does is his belief in his own ability and also in what he knows works. And so with McCarthy and then more recently with LaFleur, I think what you see is sometimes him pushing back on a head coach that you might not see in any other sideline, except for maybe with a Tom Brady or Peyton Manning when he was still playing. Very few players are going to get away with that. And so you could see a power struggle if there are not changes. I'm sure Rodgers is conscious of legacy, but he has a massive ego, and great players do, but great players also recognize that sometimes you have to let go of certain things to get a different result. Time will tell.
Let's move on to some other teams here. In the NFC, you mentioned the Rams already. You talked about the Rams, but you also mentioned Tampa Bay. Tom Brady seems to be coming back strong. They are really close to being the Rams in Tampa in the divisional round last year. Tom Brady, I kind of think he should have won MVP over Rodgers, to be honest, last year. Do you see Tom Brady declining at all, or do you think they'll just keep on going like they did last year?
Well, I think you're right. I think he was a more deserving MVP. MVP almost never goes to the most valuable player. It usually goes to the best player on the best team of that year. Or, Rodgers did have fantastic numbers, but that was I would agree with you on that one from last year. Tom Brady was just named NFL top 100 number one player. I don't buy that. It's nice as a send-off, but that's not the same team. They've had injuries on their offensive line, and that's going to be the biggest issue for the Buccaneers. Really, Tom Brady could probably play another 5 years, but he needs protection more than anything else. He can make things happen with lesser weapons. He has good weapons, but he needs protection. I will say this, it's easy for fans to hate somebody like Tom Brady because you see him every year in the postseason. I liken it to, if it's 1932 and you hate Babe Ruth at the end of his career, just take the time to appreciate that you're watching somebody that's really probably a once in a century type of sports figure in that sport. Nobody's going to do what he's done for the rest of our lives. And Mahomes is fantastic, but nobody is going to go to 7+ Super Bowls, win 7 Super Bowls and get to 10. I just don't ever see that happening. So I appreciate the moment, but the Buccaneers, they have some holes. And the Cowboys are the Cowboys. They shouldn't have let Randy Gregory leave if that was as close as it could be, because they really had three guys that could put pressure on the quarterback that were elite, and you never have that. And they have a secondary that can make plays. And so defense is there, but same as the Buccaneers, the Cowboys now have injuries at the offensive line. That's a huge problem. And they also, like the Packers, their wide receiving core is not what it was. So CeeDee Lamb has been a really solid number two. Whether he can be a true number one receiver and he's ready to step into that role, we'll see. Cowboys have always had talent, but they're not well coached. And I really feel like it's an open race in the NFC, but you have 4 or 5 teams that are about the same. And maybe this is where an Arizona or somebody else, a San Francisco, somebody else emerges with some new talent. San Francisco with the change of quarterback is kind of curious. So I'm not expecting as much out of them. And Arizona's had a lot of distractions with Murray's contract and some injuries. Everybody's kind of in the same boat in the NFC. And I'd be lying if I said I really had a good feel for which team is going to emerge out of that conference.
San Francisco, like you mentioned, is interesting because Trey Lance is going to, I think he's going to start week 1. Yeah. And Garoppolo is going to be in San Francisco still as a backup QB, which is probably the best backup in the whole NFL. But I know Trey Lance looked really good in those preseason games. And this situation is really reminding me of what Kansas City did with Mahomes, where Mahomes did not play the first season. And then Mahomes started the second season and absolutely blew up. I kind of think that a lot of people are expecting Trey Lance to do the same thing. And do you think that's realistic to think?
I don't. I think people look at the best case scenario and then they take their hopes and make it their expectation. And in that case that you mentioned, that's probably the best model, because Alex Smith was a proven winner in San Francisco and in Kansas City, but Patrick Mahomes is one of the best quarterbacks in the league. He came into that draft, I think, was the best quarterback in that draft, but he had some questions. But his comparison was Favre. Good arm strength, kind of a wild card, makes things happen on the move. And I think Andy Reid, the piece there is that both Shanahan and Reid, you have to give them credit. And I do put a lot of faith into Kyle Shanahan. Andy Reid knows what he's doing. He's been around quarterbacks his whole career. So his ability to make that judgment call where you had Alex Smith was a steady, we'll get you to the playoffs, that's a gutsy move. I think Garoppolo is probably not Alex Smith, but he's still a very good quarterback. Trey Lance, to me, is not as sure of a bet as I think Patrick Mahomes is. So if this works out and if it's another Mahomes thing, fantastic. But if Trey Lance doesn't take off through the month of September, they have a big problem on their hands, because now they're paying Garoppolo. They've won with Garoppolo, and they couldn't get rid of him. They couldn't get what they wanted. And now all of a sudden you have the potential for a really bad quarterback controversy, but also Trey Lance. Now people discount confidence. A quarterback can have all of the talent in the world, but part of the reason it's good to hold them out for a year or two is that you put them in too early. And if they blow their confidence, they'll never recover in some cases. Well, now they've put Trey Lance kind of into that spot. And if he doesn't succeed, he may never be their guy, because Garoppolo's on the roster. You know, if they didn't have Garoppolo, it'd be easy to just kind of ride it out with Lance for this year, and then maybe next year is his year. Now, if he doesn't succeed and they're forced to put Garoppolo in there to compete for the division, they may never have Trey Lance in what you're describing. So that's the team that I think this is a make or break year for them and for that prospect, because they couldn't get rid of Garoppolo, and now they have 2 quarterbacks that everybody expects can win.
Yeah, I was pretty shocked that Garoppolo did not get traded anywhere. I thought he would maybe go to the Panthers or the Seahawks, and still in San Francisco. I was very surprised by that.
I mean, I don't think there's any question that Seattle would have entertained that. The problem is that if you deal somebody that is a decent or better than decent quarterback within your division, and all of a sudden Seattle has a better record than San Francisco, that's a death sentence. And it's almost like, you have to get 2 for 1 out of them, because you're feeding somebody that you're competing against, not just twice a year, but, ultimately you have to get through your division to go anywhere. So I think it was more a matter of the best suitor for him was probably within their division. And Carolina's got 2 of the same already. So Garoppolo, I'm not sure that would have made sense. Certainly not after the Baker Mayfield pickup. So it just didn't get done. And now it's a potential liability. As much as it's an insurance card for them, it's also a liability for them.
I do want to quickly go to the AFC since we talked about the NFC here. We already talked about how the Bills are looking like they are the favorites to win the AFC this year. That's a lot of people's opinions. Do you agree with that?
Well, the Patriots got better last year. I really feel like, Jones had a solid first year. So the Patriots are going to be competitive for them. The difference is if you look at historically the best teams or the steadiest teams in the AFC, it's pretty well stocked in the North. And so the Steelers, they have a rebuilding year. Okay. We don't know what they're going to look like at the quarterback position, but the Steelers are never to be discounted. The Ravens are one of those teams where I really feel like Jackson is if he ever kind of gets a better balance in his athleticism, because I think he leaves himself vulnerable. He tries to extend someplace he shouldn't, and he turned the ball over a few times, I think, because of that. If he can clean up some of that, he is as dangerous as anybody. And the Ravens are always well coached, always play sound defense and ball control. And the Bengals were the team. So the AFC North, all of that talent kind of cancels itself out. To me, that's why Buffalo is attractive. I think a team like the Chargers, historically, a team like that is usually has a letdown. So you have kind of this exciting season. They're on the cusp. Everybody's looking at them. And that's really where maybe a dose of reality sets in. Because I felt like they played out of their minds last year. They were in that exciting back and forth game in the postseason. So that's a team where I think people have expectations there. They have to contend with Kansas City. I think the Raiders are better, but let's be honest, the West is just loaded, much like the North. So those teams kind of cancel each other out. And then if you look at the South, Tennessee has been there. And they're well coached, and that's the Patriots of the South. And I think that they'll be a strong team, but all of that kind of leads back to Buffalo, where everybody else kind of cancels out within their division. It makes Buffalo an easy pick in the AFC, in my opinion.
Yeah, the AFC West is going to be the most competitive division. I think Buffalo kind of has the East in the bag, even though the Dolphins are really trying to make some moves to get in the playoffs. They got Tyreek Hill from the Chiefs, but unless Denver situation with Russell Wilson becomes what happened when Peyton Manning got there, I kind of think it's going to be Buffalo in the Super Bowl.
Yeah, and I mean Russell Wilson is not Peyton Manning. I mean, he'll make it better, but every team in that division got better. I don't think Tua is a bad quarterback. I'm one of those where I feel like he gets a bad rap. I feel like if he had a little bit more patience and support, I think that they could comfortably, I think the fan base would be more comfortable down there. They got better, and the Jets got better. They'll probably still be fourth in that division, but I think that they're slightly more competitive because their younger players are now a year older. I think they added in the right spots. So I don't think it's a picnic for the Bills, but I do feel like if you look at those divisions, who's coming out of the West? Well, probably Kansas City, but who knows? Who's coming out of the North? Ravens, Bengals, I don't know. In the East, it seems like of those 4 divisions, that's the one where you go, I like Buffalo. If you were going to bet something, you'd probably bet on the East. And then the South, that seems like lesser talent to me. Nobody's afraid of the Texans. The Jaguars have plenty of holes still, and they're very much rebuilding. So Buffalo is kind of the easy pick for anybody to get into the Super Bowl.
So I want to know here before we end, who do you predict to be in the Super Bowl and who do you think's going to win?
Hmm. I really don't like making Super Bowl picks before the season because I feel like you throwing two names out there, and I would much rather make an October 1 pick. But that said, let's see. I I'm going to go with Baltimore. Um, and on the NFC side, I'll go with Dallas. What can you say? Probably not in, yeah, it's probably not my best judgment, but in a year like this, it's not going to be two teams that everybody thinks will just slide in there. So I'll pick preseason Baltimore and Dallas, and I'll probably be eating crow later, but that's okay.
And I'm assuming since you're a Dallas fan, you have to go with Dallas to win the Super Bowl in that one.
I mean, if they were playing, I actually think Baltimore can be a very strong team this year. So strictly based on what I'm picking, I would say Baltimore. Dallas is a wild card to get there, but it's wide open in the NFC.
I think my prediction would probably be Buffalo and Tampa in the Super Bowl. I think that's what I'm thinking. Uh, and I think the Packers are probably going to go. They're probably going to lose to either Tampa or the Rams or San Francisco, especially if Lance does even like close to like just a top 10 QB. I think San Francisco's just going to that'd be huge for them. That's kind of their missing piece. So I'm kind of thinking that the Packers kind of have it stacked against them this year a little bit.
I'd be very happy if the Packers won 11 games. And I don't think 10-7 is going to be an awful year for them. But 11-6, if they are able to win 11 games, I think that's going to be a successful regular season for Green Bay.
Thank you, Mike Beacom, for being on PodPaca today. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram to find out when new episodes are. If you're listening on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, you can follow our page on both of those websites. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel because we might have some only YouTube content coming up soon with PodPaca. So thank you again, Mike, for being on today's podcast. And everyone, I hope you have a good rest of your day.
I enjoyed the time, and thanks for having me on your podcast.